speaking. I hear him. I hear that he just popped in. Let me bring him on. Ah, there you are. We're joined with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He is distinguishing visiting professor in government and public policy at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. He also taught 6 years for the University of Honors program at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He is also probably best known as retired United States Army Colonel and former Chief of Staff for U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. Colonel Wilkerson, man, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Surely. Good to be with you.
So I guess my first question starts, I want to start off at the very beginning. What happened to Syria?
Easy to answer in a very short sentence. What happened to Syria is Israel, the United States, and Great Britain. And footnote, Turkey as an accomplice.
Okay. Yes, fair enough. From the standpoint of all of these countries that are getting involved, in the way that let me ask it this way. Seymour Hersh points out that this goes all the way back to 2007, meaning the Bush era, where they were changing.
All the way back to 2002.
2002. Okay, fair enough. I was going back to Seymour Hersh article. So what was the objective in trying to knock over that government all the way back in 2002?
The overall strategic objective has been the same since Paul Wolfowitz and his boys produced the clean break strategy, which essentially says, this is an oversimplification, but to make it easy for your listeners, and I'm not doing it too badly, meant creating chaos across the Levant, across Southwest Asia, across the Middle East, even North Africa. This chaos would then ensure not only Israeli security, but it would also ensure U.S. hegemony for decades to come over the region. And that's what the clean break strategy was all about. It started its implementation after 9/11 because that gave them the excuse to do it. That's why we diverted from Afghanistan so rapidly and went to Iraq, because that began it. Now let's pick up on Syria. The theory was, and the briefing was in the Pentagon, that once we pulled down Saddam Hussein, which Donald Rumsfeld thought would only take 40 or 50 days, then Assad would be so frightened he would abandon his government, or we would just transfer our forces into Syria and cause him to have to abandon his government. Well, that went to hell in a handbag, as you well know, because an insurgency broke out in Iraq that kept us occupied for almost a decade. So at that particular time, President Bush turned to George Tenet, then the director of Central Intelligence, and said, make Assad fall. Money's no object. And ever since then, we've been doing that. President Obama picked up on it in 2015 and actually passed a presidential finding, if you will, that said that was our purpose and added billions more to it. And the Congress, of course, passed legislation to that effect. So for many years, at least 20, and decidedly for at least a dozen, we've been trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad.
Wow. And he has been clinging to power up until effectively this particular point. Why do you think this was the time where he wasn't necessarily able to cling to it in this moment, even though, in 2015, he had lost like the majority of that country, fought like grim death in order to maintain power in that country with the help of the Russians and with the help of the Iranians. Why do you think this was the moment where it all fell apart as opposed to back in 2015?
It was all building towards this, of course, but no one was going to predict the specific moment. And I frankly think it came as a surprise to Ankara, Washington, and Jerusalem. A big surprise, as well as the poodle of Washington, London. They didn't realize that what they had done what they were doing, I should say, had been so effective in destabilizing Assad. And Assad added to it majorly. Now, go back and look at the sanctions we put on Syria, and you see one of the reasons Assad fell apart himself, because the sanctions were devastating. They were absolutely devastating. Add to that the droughts that Syria had experienced, some of the worst droughts in Syria's history, if not the worst, 2 years in a row, killed their farm products and their agricultural industry. You had soldiers in the Syrian army who were, let's say, paid $200 or $300 a month, U.S. equivalent, they then were being paid $20 or $30 a month. If you had a family, you were coming apart at the seams. And Assad refused to listen to the Iranian council or the Russian council, both of whom told him, this is happening to you. You need to do something about it. We'll be glad to help you if you want. And Assad refused it and instead turned to the Arab states, wanted back into the fold of the Arab League, which they granted, wanted to be recognized by them again as an Arab state. And they turned their backs on him, really. They acted like they wanted him back, but they essentially aided in the process of bringing him down. It's a very complicated story, but the end product is it happened a lot faster than anybody imagined. And so now you have Turkey exploiting it in the Northeast. You have Israel exploiting it to the tune of having tanks just outside Damascus and having taken over Mount Hermon, the exquisite ski resort in the area, and having Israelis on platforms beneath with binoculars looking into Damascus down that basically empty territory around the road to Damascus. And you have Bibi Netanyahu maximizing his taking of land, if you will, to protect the Golan Heights, and no one knows where that will stop. And you have Turkey trying to eliminate its main enemy in the northeastern part of Syria, the Kurds, and the United States is backing those Kurds. So you have a terrible mess, really, but the mess adds, as I said, to the purpose, strategic purpose of our plans to create chaos in the region.
But, I mean, but this is not really chaos anymore at this point. I mean, well, it is chaos, I guess, but what I'm getting at is it's not. Yes, the Kurds are going to be fighting the Turkish-backed jihadists, and that's taking place now where the Kurds are losing more and more territory. And I guess that breaks into two questions. One, the U.S. is not going to have any control over Turkey, meaning Turkey has every incentive in the world in order to allow those jihadists to crush those U.S.-backed Kurds. Or is that true or false? Before I get to the next question.
It's true to an extent, but I don't think unless Turkey actually deploys mainline forces, it's not going to defeat these Kurds. These Kurds are relentless fighters. We found that out with the Peshmerga in northern Iraq. They stretch all the way from northern Iraq through Iran over to Syria, and or through Syria over to Iran, and they are looking for an autonomous entity in each of their enclaves. Now, at any moment, if the Kurds could find leadership that would merge their interests, so to speak, and combine their efforts, they would be a formidable force. But even individually, and particularly in Syria, they're a pretty formidable force, especially with the United States behind them. Now, we've done in the past, you know this probably, we deserted them in northern Iraq after the first Gulf War and essentially left them to their own devices. So I wouldn't trust the United States where are the Kurds any further than I could spit. In fact, if I were anyone in the world, I wouldn't trust the United States any further than I could spit. Ukraine is a perfect example of that. But it's a mess up there. And I haven't even added that we have troops and contractors throughout that region of Syria because we're stealing Syrian oil and pumping it to Israel. We've been doing that for some time.
Well, that was kind of my point. I would have thought that the Turkish-backed rebels would have wanted that back, meaning regardless of the fact that they were trained, supported by the U.S. and everything else, when it came down to it, it seemed that Turkey was the one that was in charge of it in regards to the payroll. And so I would have imagined that those jihadists want all of Syria, including the most wealthiest parts of Syria. Hence, the conflict that they're having now with the Kurdish forces in the north. Or am I getting that wrong?
No, you may be right in terms of their overall objectives. I don't think anyone, I'm not even sure Mohammed al-Sholani knows what their overall objective is, frankly. But I think he's tactical every day. He changes his views every day. But they're taking on the United States if they do that. And that's a formidable take on any way you look at it. So I think they're going to be very reluctant to go up in what is essentially an Alawite area but in an area where the United States has forces, limited forces to be sure, but it is the United States. It is the stars and stripes that are flying over them. And they've been there for a long time, and they have very established camps, 5 or 6 of them. And I don't think they're leaving. And they also have Jordan behind them, and they have Iraq behind them. You know, just this morning, I was reading how the Iraqi Shia militias are pouring, I don't know whether that's the right word or not, into Syria too, to add to the contention. So Jelani's got a mess on his hands at best. And at worst, he's got a civil war on his hands that will mean the utter destruction for a long time to come of what we know is the state of Syria.
Well, does HTS even control Syria at this point? Meaning, is it a oh, okay.
No, they don't. Not in the sense that a sovereign state has a military capable of defending it. No, because Syria is not a sovereign state anymore.
Right. At this point, it's being carved up by multiple countries: Israel, yes, Turkey, America, etc. Wow. Yeah, that's unfortunate. It's like you said, it's no longer a sovereign state. From your take on this, do you believe that al-Jilani, if he doesn't necessarily control it, what HTS, how would you define HTS? Would you consider that to be a group of organizations, in which case that there's infighting within the context of the group? How do you regard that group, that organization?
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, I think HTS is a creation in large part of the United States of America and its CIA, and Britain and its MI6. I think they put together a whole bunch of really nefarious terrorist groups, including people who cut other people's throats on television, and people who brought down the towers in New York and struck the Pentagon, Al-Qaeda. They put all these groups together. They renamed some of them. They paid them enormous amounts of money. They gave them huge arms stores, much of which came from Libya. Remember the arms cache in Libya, which was probably one of the largest in the world, that suddenly disappeared after we took down Gaddafi? Well, a lot of those weapons, and go back to Benghazi. This is what Ambassador Chris Stevens was killed over. The arms transfers that he was not necessarily looking forward to orchestrating from his own perch. And those arms transfers went to the terrorists that we were going to arm in the future. Think back to Afghanistan when Zig Brzezinski and his boys under Carter were going after the Soviets in Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda. The people who brought down the towers were the people we were supporting, hook, line, and sinker in Afghanistan. Well, we're doing that again. We're using them again. We're using the very people who brought down the towers in New York to help us destroy the equilibrium and bring chaos to Syria and to Southwest Asia in general, because we believe in that chaos. And when I say we, I mean neoconservatives and Jewish Americans who are allied with Netanyahu and others like that, billionaires, some of them. We believe that chaos in the region is making Israel more secure.
That is, talk about a tiger by the tail on that one. I mean, do they honestly believe that being side by side with a terrorist state is safe for the long-term future and stability of Israel, or for that matter, even the United States?
That's a very good question, which screams for an answer over the next 5 to 10 years. We'll see if this was a wise move, or if it was more or less like the moves we made in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, and elsewhere where we have wreaked havoc in order to bring chaos.
You were in the government. You could see how there's a friend of the show, John Kiriakou, and John talks about how there was a scene that he was sitting in the meeting where Dick Cheney comes in, and Dick Cheney is effectively, once they got the military authorization to go into Iraq, and Cheney comes out and tells everybody effectively, all right, we're going to be in Iran in, X number of years. And the guy who was listening to the meeting, he turns to John, he says, did he say Iran? He says, yes, thank you. And then he cut the mic back on and just listened as if nothing had taken place. Like, what is going on in these people's heads? Like, do they just not accept the gravity of what they're doing? Do they just think, oh, this is just going to turn out great? What's the logic of it? There's nobody who turns around and says, well, wait a minute. These are terrorists. These guys were chopping off heads. It's not like he evolved over the course of a summer. It was like, yeah, I used to chop off heads, when I was in my youth. But now that I've grown, I don't no longer chop off heads. Like, certainly they know that these were the same people that were killing Americans. These were the same people that flew planes into the towers. Nobody sits in and says, wait a minute, this is not the best of ideas. Nobody does that. It's just full speed ahead. We'll deal with the consequences later. We're America. We can totally dictate the term of events after the fact.
Well, this is a cruel thing to say, but I actually believe, and I've rubbed shoulders with some of these people, so I have some credibility here, that some actually think that what they have done is positive for America's future. Because what they have done is, first of all, protected America's ally in the Middle East, Israel. And second, they have begun the process through the chaos they've created with sanctions and military action and proxy wars, think Ukraine, of reestablishing what was a slipping American hegemony over most of the globe. And they're right about that. It is slipping. It's slipping majorly. Power is historically moving in the opposite direction that it moved for 1,000+ years toward the West. Power is going back to the East. It's going back to the East predominantly because that's what's happening economically and financially and trade-wise. But the magnet for that, of course, the sucking magnet, if you will, is the same magnet that was there for 3,000 years, China.
Right.
And that's what's scaring the United States literally to death. That's why we're doing all these stupid things. Germany is falling apart now. France is falling apart. I predicted all this 9 months ago. It's all going to hell, and yet we just add more logs to the fire, gas to the fire, whatever your metaphor, every day. Look, we can't even get out of the mess we started in Ukraine, and we have lost there. We have categorically and devastatingly lost there. NATO has lost there. So we just keep reinforcing failure because we're so scared, so frightened that that power shift, which is taking place inexorably, is going to hurt us. And it will. It will hurt us economically, trade-wise, and otherwise. But it's going to hurt us even more so because we're so inept at handling it.
What does this mean for Russia now that Syria has fundamentally collapsed under this model?
Not much of a loss for Russia, really. You can say that, okay, if their two bases in Syria are abandoned, and it looks very much like they're going to be, will they transfer the flag to Iran? I doubt Iran will do that because Iran right now is taking somewhat of a licking too. So it's seeking, I think, underneath the covers right now, it's seeking with the new Trump administration to effect a new deal on stopping their nuclear program. So there are talks, I think, secret talks going on right now to that effect. So the dynamics have shifted somewhat, but it hasn't hurt Russia that much because Russia still has its access to the Black Sea, even more so now, possibly, if they keep on with this war. I have said all along, or the military in Russia at least, maybe not Putin. Putin sees a downside to this, but the military, I'd be saying, go on to Odessa. I want to own the whole north shore of the Black Sea. And Odessa is the most important key to that. And they could go on to Odessa pretty easily. It wouldn't be easy militarily because Odessa is full of people who will fight them to the death, not for Ukraine. They don't give a hang about Ukraine. What they care about is the crime in Odessa, which is one of the richest criminal centers in the world. So they would fight tooth and nail. Think of invading the docks of New York when Lucky Luciano was running them. That should be doing. But nonetheless, it just shows you how Russia's not been really damaged that much. And we will see some developments that Russia will conjure out of whole cloth that will be as frightening as anything was in terms of their bases in Syria for the Mediterranean. I guarantee you that. especially if we continue this insanity in Ukraine.
Wait, what do you mean by that? Explain that one. You said that
we're also trying to open a front in Georgia.
Right.
You may know we just had very fair and free elections in Georgia and very squeaky victory. But the people who won and are now to take power in Georgia are not for close association with NATO, certainly not for NATO membership. Therefore, a balanced policy, Russia on top of them and Europe and the United States some ways away, therefore a balanced policy. And they're mostly for trade and making the Caucasus popular again and, you know, making money. That's what they want to do. Well, they're up against a CIA funded effort to nullify the election and to get the former people back in. The president right now, who says she won't leave, Salome, I have to look up her name, Salome
Zordili or something like that. But she lost.
She's French and Georgian. So maybe that explains her attraction to the EU. But anyway, she's saying she won't leave. And we're there. Think Mossadegh, 1953, Iran. U.S. and Britain overthrowing Mossadegh. Well, that's what we're doing. I bet we're paying her. And I bet we're paying newspaper editors and other people in Georgia because we want to open this other front against Putin. Well, I got news for us. We keep doing this sort of thing, and we're going to destabilize half of the world. And that half of the world is rapidly becoming 3/4 of the world that hates our living guts. Think about this for a moment. 1 in 5 humans on the planet is Chinese. 2 in 5 are Chinese or Indian. 3 in 5, over half, are Asian. That's where the power's going. That's where the money's going. That's where economic success is. That's where trillions and trillions, the BRICS countries, plus the 14 that now have said they want to be a member, their combined GDP is over $70 trillion. This is inexorable. It's happening. History is pushing it to happen. And we're fighting that history. And we're going to lose. And Putin, you asked about Russia, Putin has both the disfavor and the favor of being in both worlds, the Asian world and the Western world. And that's a problem for Putin. There's no question about that, because he's fighting the tensions at both ends, as it were. He's fighting against China being the hegemon, even though they're a tacit ally now because of Ukraine. And he's fighting against us being the hegemon, disappearing, but nonetheless still the hegemon and still able. Ricardo Alarcón in Cuba once said to me, even a dying elephant can thrash a lot of grass. Well, that's what we're doing right now. We're a dying elephant thrashing a lot of grass, and that grass are human lives, particularly in places like Gaza, Lebanon, and other areas where Israel just is indiscriminately killing people. Look at what they've done to Syria now. Yesterday, the strike total was over 800. 800 sorties by Israeli Air Force bomb-laden jets into Syria. What are they doing now? Bombing the rubble?
The U.S. doesn't get how radically this kills any notion of credibility across the globe. Like, I just remember in the old days, we used to care about that stuff. I remember when Ronald Reagan, when it was discovered, the Iran-Contra affair. And Ronald Reagan, I remember it comes out, you know, they used to have the old, they show the White House, and then it used to fade to the president. And he effectively says something like, I'm the Gipper. I didn't know anything about this. But the buck stops with me. And so, you know, there's that. And people, it was a crisis. Like, people were freaking out, like, oh my God, they were having hearings and everything else. And it was like, I can't believe the US is doing this. We've been overthrowing governments. This is outrageous. Now, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't get publicity. It's something that is just kind of is what it is. Like, this stuff just seems to be a radical loss of credibility. Do they just not care? Or as like social media made things so transparent that it's not easy to hide? Give me your take on this. Like, because it does seem to be a change in the way that we've operated. Or is it just the threat of losing that hegemony is so significant now that we don't really care about the loss of credibility? We're doing what we have to do in order to try to maintain our status.
Well, your latter point is probably the operative point here, but let me point out, and this is my special field of study, that from 1953, when we overthrew Mossadegh in Iran, to 1954, when we overthrew Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, to a host of other similar activities, all the way up to Chile in 69 and 70 and 71, when we overthrew Salvador Allende, a heinous thing to do at the time, put Pinochet in power. We've been doing this. But you're right, we've been a little more circumspect about the publicity. We've had presidents who put a fine patina on these actions. Some didn't even have to talk about it, like Eisenhower in 53. But we've been doing this all along, but we've been doing it in accordance with some sort of strategy. Like, for example, Eisenhower's overthrow of Mossadegh gave us 26 years of stability in the Persian Gulf, which was one of the most important corridors for oil in the world. And we had a Shah there who was our protector of that for 26 years. Now, you can argue it produced a revolution and the problems we have today, and you would be flat right, no question. However, today, as you insinuated in the latter part of your comments very accurately, we have lost our equilibrium, strategic, operational, and otherwise. We just don't care what we do anymore because we're so desperate to preserve our power. And we don't tell the American people about it. Look, the Congress is involved in nonsense from day to day to day to day. You got Kennedy from Louisiana acting like an asshole. You got Josh Hawley from Missouri acting like an asshole. And on the Democratic side, you got Schumer acting like an ass. They don't care about anything. They don't care about their voters anymore because they buy their elected seats. They buy them from Lockheed Martin. They buy them from big industry. It's not the people's representatives anymore. And what you have in the White House are people who are brain dead, first of all, and second, tied to Israel with an umbilical cord that is unbreakable, and third, absolutely unconscious or oblivious to what we are doing in the world with our policies of sanctions and force. Because that's our policy. We do not have any diplomacy anymore. We do not have any foreign policy. What we have is bombs, bullets, and bayonets, and proxies who can do that for us, like Israel, and on the other hand, sanctions. We have 1/3 of the citizens of the world under some sort of sanction now. 1/3. That's not going to endure. It's going to make us a pariah.
Well, I would argue it has made us a pariah. How did it get to that point? Because it wasn't always that way. I mean, I get the sense, and this could just be historical, blinders, but I get the sense that we were at some point had this argument of we're freedom, we're justice, we're love and light, we're open media. This is what we are, and we're proud of it, especially in contests with, let's say, something like the Soviet Union, where we would say, well, we're clearly the better alternative, and the world can kind of make their judgments in regards to what they wanted. That's not really true today. I mean, what the argument that they're using today is multipolarity, this idea that we should have a multipolar world. We don't necessarily want this notion of hegemons. We're going to deal with each other as equals. We're not going to sanction. And that argument is a soothing argument in comparison to we're exceptional. Everybody else is, vassals. We want to maintain our hegemony. The hegemony argument seems like it fails in comparison to we're equals. And yet they run with that argument without any issue. And Europe backs them in that argument. How did we get to that point? That part is fascinating to me, how it changed.
Again, you're in my area of expertise, university professor speaking. Basically, what I taught was fateful decision-making from 1945 to the present. And I encompassed in that Harry Truman's decision in Korea, all the way up to Obama's decision with regard to Libya. And by fateful decision-making, we meant in our seminars, we meant a state making decisions that sent young men and young women to die for state purposes and to kill others for state purposes, war and covert operations. And we studied everything from 1945 forward, all the way up to Libya. And my students, I think, would have come to a conclusion, I hope they did anyway, that it was getting worse every day that went by during that half-century plus period. Yeah. And after 9/11, it just went absolutely insane. 9/11 was an excuse, for example, for the neoconservatives to do what they did. Sometimes I have trouble believing conspiracy theories, as such as they are, but I would have no difficulty believing a theory that someone from Israel or someone from this country or someone from the tandem had something to do with 9/11, because it was such a perfect thing to happen, to set these people loose and to set them among the chickens, as it were, because that's what they've been doing ever since. If we are an empire, and we most certainly are, and we started in 1945, then we became a Nero-led like empire on 9/11. And we have had no leader since, and I include Barack Obama in this, even though he was, I think, very apologetic at the end of his second term, because he understood what some of the things he'd done, like Libya, were just a part of the Washington war game and not sound decision making. I actually met with Obama in the Roosevelt Room in the last year of his administration. Ostensibly, he was going to thank us, along with John Kerry, his then Secretary of State, for our work on the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. Well, he talked about that for about 2 minutes, and then he talked about and started his conversation with this sentence. I'll never forget it. I put it at the head of my syllabus at William and Mary after that meeting. There's a bias in this town toward war. This is out of the mouth of President Obama. And then he told us he didn't know what to do about it. And he was right. I mean, I wanted to tell him, I teach this stuff, Mr. President. You're right. And you can't do anything about it, because it's beyond the president's power to do anything about it. And Donald Trump is just a joke, because he thinks he can do something about it. He can't. The powers are too big for him to control. And he'll just make a bigger mess of it than any previous president, probably. Anyway, it's empire in decline. It's empire in decline. Throughout history, 5,000 years of history, this is how empires go out.
So from your, just two more questions. From the standpoint of Donald Trump, why do you, he has been making this argument that I'm going to end wars, not start them. And then he put every creature and swamp monster that he could find into his administration. Like, certainly this is a joke, right? Or do you think he's trying to get some kind of weird, I'm going to have Tulsi Gabbard, RFK, I'm going to have Matt Gaetz. These people tend to be less inclined towards war, at the very least, talk about it. But then I'm going to have Hegseth, Rubio, and I forget some of the other swamp monsters that he's
Arch neoconservatives.
Exactly.
Rubio could be put at the head of the pack of neocons.
How on earth does he believe he's going to manage this group to be less inclined to war as opposed to predisposed to it? I mean, I tend to think people of policy, if you're putting those people in policy positions, it gives some kind of context about what you're going to get. Or do you think he's playing some kind of 10-dimensional chess in this? What are your thoughts on this?
I'm not sure Donald Trump knows what he's doing from day to day, and I think he makes it up as he goes along in many respects, but based against a political tapestry that he understands very well. I've got to keep my MAGA boys happy, my MAGA girls happy. So that's what he's really pushing all his decisions against, ultimately. I don't think any of these cabinet picks will be in office in 9 months. I think they'll all be fired. Will have left. It'll be a repeat to a certain extent of the first Trump administration. I do think, though, there's a very, very huge misunderstanding about Trump being anti-war. He's not anti-war. He's just anti-stupid wars that will make him political gain to denounce them. But in terms of starting wars or doing wars himself, I mean, this is the man who killed Soleimani, who was a member of the Iranian government, mind you, and set the precedent for what's just happened in Moscow, for example. Ukraine apparently killed that Russian general on the streets of Moscow. This is not something you wanted to get started, but we have started it. And to a large extent, that strike against Soleimani said, hey, if the empire can do it, we can all do it. He was a member of the Iranian government, and we struck him in Iraq. He was on a peace mission, too. And we struck him and killed him. So I think Trump has been taken in the community of those for or against war as being in the against war community. I think that's a false conception altogether.
Yeah, I think the thing is, because of that bias in the regards to the orthodoxy towards war and conflict, that the very notion that Donald Trump is open to a compromise makes him different in some way. Like, yeah, I'll go and sit down and talk with the North Korean leader, or yeah, I'll stop Obama's regime change war program in Afghanistan. I'm sorry, in Syria, even though I'm stealing the oil. Like, he seemed to be at the very least open in a way that,
Remember Trump's statement though?
yeah,
Trump was very
stealing oil.
straightforward about that. He said, "I've got the oil.
Yeah.
Believe me, I've got the oil. I've got the oil in Syria. The oil is ours in Syria. It's ours. You understand? I've got the oil."
Yeah, I'm taking the oil. I'm taking the oil. Stealing oil. I'm stealing oil. I guess, and the last question on this, well, is the U.S., do you think Israel is really teeing up to go against Israel? And are we going to get dragged into it if they do? Because just to frame it, against Iran. Iran has said, if you attack us, we are going to basically hit every oil field that is in this area. We're going to shut the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to effectively destroy the world. This is our deterrent. We don't need nuclear weapons in this case. I guess, for one, do you believe them? Meaning, do you believe Israel as they're saying they're going to hit Iran? And two, will Iran do that?
I do not think that Israel will hit Iran in a sense of it being existential to Iran without the United States.
Okay.
And I'm not sure that either Biden or Trump, and increasingly we're talking about Trump now, time alone remaining for Biden is pretty short. I don't think we're going to join them. I could be wrong. I could be dead wrong. And I might be dead wrong, because this is not going to be a pushover. This is going to be a 10-year war, a couple of trillions of dollars, a draft in America, which will send a lot of young people scurrying into Canada and Mexico. Wait and see how much American youth want to fight for this empire. The comment made the other day on our All Volunteer Force Forum site sums it all up. This young man said, "I'm of draft age. I'm 21 years old. I've just graduated university. I have no qualms about violence if it is used for a good purpose.
Right.
But I would not be enlisted or recruited to the armed forces of the United States in order to participate in brutal, senseless, stupid, hegemonic wars." End of quote. He's right. And that's probably
Right.
about the way most American youth would feel about a wholesale draft. And yet that's what we'd have to do to fight Iran. Now, there's an alternative. And I'm worried about this alternative. We could use nuclear weapons.
Against who?
Against whomever you want to throw into the target base. Remember, 1945, we're the only country on the face of the earth who's used nuclear weapons in anger. We'll do it again. And we'll do it when we find out we don't have the conventional military might to do Russia, to do China, or even to do Iran. And we certainly don't have the might to do them in combination. And they are in tacit combination now.
Yes, at this point. Are you concerned that Joe Biden is going to end the world? Meaning not, I mean, for that matter, even Trump, if Trump can't save face. And this could be the last question. This notion of, it seems that they don't believe Russia's red lines, that they think for whatever reason that Putin is bluffing and that he did the Oreshnik in order for a once-off. Despite the fact, if they listen to his speeches, he's getting, for one, he's a moderate. He's not this monster that they make him out to be. If that was the case, we'd already be in a third world war. But from your take, I mean, I am very disturbed by Joe Biden's logic in this belief that, well, Putin believes that Trump is going to do something different, so Putin will allow me to escalate to a certain degree without him responding in some kind of way that would drag NATO into a war. That's what it seems that Biden is thinking in this case. But I don't, there's no way for Biden to know if that's true or not, or whether or not Putin even believes that Donald Trump will bring this to a close, regardless of what Donald Trump is saying. Trump is a wild card. Are you concerned that either Trump or, for that matter, Biden is going to drag us into some kind of thing that we can't step back from out of hubris and just incompetence?
I am, and there's plenty of evidence for what you just said in terms of my concern being genuine. Not least of which was Rear Admiral Buchanan speaking for the U.S. Strategic Command and his cavalier way of saying that we'd win a nuclear war. No one wins a nuclear war. And if they're thinking that way, that's extremely dangerous. And I do not think Joe Biden is in charge anymore. I think Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are in charge, and they scare me because they don't have the mandate of the people, not in any way, fashion, or form. And they are crazy people. They are crazy people who are leading this empire in its most tumultuous period, and they're leading it ineptly, inexpertly, and badly. And they're in charge. I do hearken back to what Colin Powell once said to me, half in jest, but as I would learn over time, the jest was more real than not. Joe Biden's a good guy. He knows the foreign relations field fairly well. I'd rather talk to him than I would Dick Lugar and blah, blah, blah. Then he looked, and he paused, and he said, but I would never make him president.
Mm. That sounds like Obama. Never underestimate the opportunity for Joe Biden to F stuff up.
Yep. Precisely.
Well, Colonel Wilkerson, I always enjoy talking to you. Thank you for this. I really do appreciate it. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, he is Distinguished Visiting Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, my hometown, Richmond. He also taught 6 years at the University Honors Program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where I currently live. He is, and probably is best known as retired United States Army Colonel and former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Thank you for this. I really appreciate this conversation.
Certainly. I want to say God rest his soul.
Yeah, he's a good.
And his wife. Now Alma's gone too.
Oh, I didn't realize his wife had passed.
Yeah, she passed just about a year ago.
Wow, we are getting old. We're getting old.
Tell me about
it. Man, thank you for this. I always appreciate these conversations. And look, I have appreciated you at a distance for years now. I have listened to some of your speeches. I've listened to some of your interviews, and I have definitely appreciated your point of view and your tenor. It's experience. You know what I'm talking about. No, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for giving me the chance to speak to another community.
Oh, absolutely. You have a good one.
You too.
Oh,